It was the first day of the new school term, and the morning buzz filled the air as students shuffled into the classroom. Among them was a girl sitting in a wheelchair, her quiet demeanor making her almost invisible to her peers. She was used to this, being overlooked, ignored, and at times pitied. Her long hair fell over her face as she avoided eye contact, clutching her books tightly in her lap. School had never been easy for her, and today would prove to be no different. The teacher entered the room, heels clicking sharply on the tiled floor, and the chatter quickly died down. With a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, she began roll call. As she reached the girl's name, the tone in her voice changed, lighter, but not in a kind way. "Ah, there she is," the teacher said, looking directly at her. "Our little overachiever. Still managing to keep up, I see." A few snickers rippled through the room, and the girl's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She kept her gaze fixed on her desk, her fingers trembling slightly as she gripped the edges of her wheelchair. This wasn't new, but it stung every time. She had grown used to whispers and side glances from classmates, but when it came from someone in a position of authority, someone meant to encourage, it cut deeper than words ever should. The teacher carried on with the lesson, but her remarks came in small, sharp jabs throughout the morning. "This might be a little too advanced for some of us," she said with a pointed glance. "But let's try anyway." The subtle ridicule was met with stifled laughs from a few students in the back, emboldened by the teacher's tone. One student, however, wasn't laughing. He sat in the middle row, his sharp eyes narrowing every time the teacher's comments grew more pointed. He was new to the school, unfamiliar with the dynamics of the classroom, but something about the way the girl shrank under the weight of the attention didn't sit right with him. When the lunch bell finally rang, the girl wheeled herself toward the door as quickly as she could. She had learned over time how to disappear, how to blend into the background and avoid further humiliation. But as she moved into the hallway, her path was blocked by a group of students who had overheard the morning's remarks. "Hey, overachiever," one of them sneered, stepping in front of her wheelchair. "What's it like being the teacher's favorite freak?" The words echoed in her ears, and for a moment, she froze. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but her voice felt trapped somewhere deep inside. Before she could react, the new student appeared, stepping between her and the group. His stance was firm, his voice steady but tinged with irritation. "Why don't you pick on someone your own size?" he said, his tone cutting through the tension like a knife. The bullies hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by his sudden intervention. But instead of backing down, one of them smirked. "Oh, look, the new kid thinks he's a hero." "Maybe I do," he shot back, his eyes unwavering. "Or maybe I just don't stand around watching people act like cowards." The hallway grew quiet, the confrontation drawing the attention of nearby students. The bullies exchanged glances, clearly unsure of how to handle this unexpected resistance. Finally, with a scoff, they walked away, their confidence visibly shaken. The girl stared at the boy, her eyes wide with surprise and something else. Gratitude. No one had ever stood up for her before. She opened her mouth to say thank you, but the words caught in her throat. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. She nodded slowly, still trying to process what had just happened. "Good," he said with a small smile, "because that's the last time they'll mess with you while I'm around." For the first time in what felt like forever, she smiled back, albeit faintly. But even as the moment passed, a knot of worry remained in her chest. The teacher's comments earlier in the day still lingered, and she knew the bullies weren't the only challenge she would face. The afternoon classes brought more of the same sharp remarks from the teacher. This time, however, the boy didn't stay silent. When the teacher made yet another cutting comment, he raised his hand. "Excuse me," he said, his tone polite but firm, "but isn't it your job to support your students, not tear them down?" The entire class turned to look at him, their eyes wide with shock. The teacher's smile faltered for a brief second before she regained her composure. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean," she said, her voice tight. "I think you do," he replied calmly. "Maybe we should focus on the lesson instead of singling people out." The tension in the room was palpable. The teacher's face hardened, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned back to the board, pretending to continue the lesson as if nothing had happened. But the damage was done. Her authority had been questioned, and the students had noticed. The girl couldn't believe what she had just witnessed. For the first time, someone had not only seen her struggle but had also spoken up against it. It felt like a small crack in the wall she had built around herself, a tiny glimmer of hope that things could change. But as the day ended and the students began packing up to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The teacher's narrowed eyes as the boy left the classroom suggested she wouldn't take his defiance lightly. And the bullies, they rarely gave up so easily. As the girl wheeled herself toward the exit, she glanced over her shoulder at the boy. He caught her eye and gave her an encouraging nod. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel entirely alone. But deep down, she knew the road ahead would still be filled with challenges. The question was, could this unexpected ally help her face them? Or would standing up for her only make things worse for them both? The answer was something she couldn't know yet, but one thing was certain. Her story had just begun. The following day, the air in the classroom felt heavier, almost as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. The girl rolled into the room quietly, hoping to slip into her usual spot unnoticed. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, and after yesterday, she felt uneasy. The teacher was already at her desk, flipping through papers with a forced calmness that didn't match the tension in her stiff movements. The boy arrived a few minutes later, his confident stride contrasting sharply with the nervous energy in the room. He didn't look around, didn't acknowledge the whispers that had followed him since the previous day. Instead, he dropped into his seat and pulled out his notebook, acting as though nothing had changed. But things had changed. The teacher stood up and began the lesson, her voice clipped and devoid of its usual fake cheerfulness. For the first time in a while, she avoided singling anyone out, at least for a while. It wasn't long, however, before her frustration boiled over. "Perhaps some of us think they're too clever for the rules," she said, her gaze landing squarely on the boy. "If that's the case, maybe they'd like to teach the class instead." The boy leaned back in his chair, meeting her stare without flinching. "I'm just here to learn like everyone else," he said calmly. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The girl glanced between them, her heart pounding. She knew this was because of her, because he had spoken up for her. The teacher's anger wasn't just directed at him. It was a warning to anyone who might think of challenging her authority again. The rest of the morning dragged on, with an undercurrent of unease shadowing every interaction. The girl felt a gnawing guilt she couldn't shake. She hadn't asked for help, hadn't expected anyone to stand up for her. And yet here he was, willingly making himself a target. During lunch, she sat alone near the edge of the courtyard, her wheelchair positioned under the shade of a large oak tree. She was trying to focus on the book in her lap when a shadow fell over her. Looking up, she saw the boy standing there, holding a sandwich in one hand and a water bottle in the other. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his tone casual. She hesitated for a moment before nodding. He sat on the bench beside her, setting his lunch down and stretching his legs out in front of him. "You okay?" he asked, glancing at her sideways. She nodded again but didn't say anything. "Look," he continued after a moment, "about yesterday, if I made things harder for you, I'm sorry. I just couldn't sit there and let it happen." She shook her head quickly, finally finding her voice. "It's not your fault," she said quietly. "But you didn't have to do that. It's not worth the trouble." He shrugged, taking a bite of his sandwich. "Maybe not, but it's the right thing to do." His words hung in the air between them, simple but heavy with meaning. She didn't know how to respond, so she didn't. Instead, they sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the bustling courtyard filling the gaps in their conversation. Later that day, the teacher's frustration came to a head. As the class worked on an assignment, she began pacing the room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. When she reached the boy's desk, she stopped, her eyes scanning his paper. "This isn't what I asked for," she said, her tone icy. He looked up at her, confused. "I followed the instructions." "Clearly, you didn't," she snapped, picking up his paper and holding it up for the class to see. This is what happens when people think they're too clever to follow directions. The girl watched in horror as the teacher's voice grew louder, each word dripping with condescension. She knew this wasn't about the assignment. It was about power, about control. The boy, to his credit, remained calm, his expression unreadable as the teacher continued her tirade. When she finally slammed the paper back onto his desk and walked away, the class was silent. No one dared to speak, but the tension was suffocating. The girl's hands gripped the wheels of her chair tightly, her heart racing. She wanted to say something, to do something, but fear held her back. After class, she waited in the hallway, her nerves a tangled mess. When the boy emerged, she rolled up to him quickly. "I'm sorry," she blurted out, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. He looked at her, puzzled. "For what?" "For everything," she said, her voice shaking. "You didn't have to get involved. Now she's taking it out on you." He gave her a small, lopsided smile. "It's not your fault," he said, echoing her earlier words. "Besides, I can handle it." She wasn't so sure. The teacher's anger didn't seem like something that would just fade away. And the bullies, they hadn't confronted her again, but she knew it was only a matter of time. As they parted ways, the girl couldn't shake the feeling that things were building towards something bigger, something she couldn't yet see. The tension in the classroom, the teacher's growing hostility, the bullies lurking in the background. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle that hadn't yet come together. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she thought about the boy's words. "It's the right thing to do." She didn't know why, but those words gave her a small spark of hope. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't entirely alone. But she also knew that standing up for what was right came with a cost. And the question lingered in her mind. How much were they both willing to pay? The days that followed were like walking on a tightrope. The classroom felt heavier with every passing moment, as if something was simmering just beneath the surface, waiting to boil over. The teacher's frustration became more apparent, her remarks sharper, her patience thinner. The girl noticed the way the boy would brace himself before speaking in class, prepared for the backlash that often followed. The bullies hadn't made another move, but their watchful eyes trailed the girl and the boy everywhere they went. She could feel it, waiting, planning. It made her stomach twist into knots. The boy didn't seem fazed, though. He walked through the halls with the same steady stride, his head held high, as if daring them to try something. But she knew better than to think they'd given up. She had learned that silence wasn't safety. It was only the calm before the storm. One afternoon, during a group project, the teacher paired her with the bullies. It felt deliberate, a calculated move to make her uncomfortable. The boy was across the room, watching closely, but there was little he could do without drawing more attention. The group sat in an awkward silence at first, each of them avoiding eye contact. Finally, one of the bullies leaned forward, a sly smirk creeping across his face. "So," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, "how's your little hero? Think he'll save you forever?" Her hands tightened on the edge of the table, but she didn't respond. She knew better than to give them ammunition. Another one chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "You know, people like you should really learn to stay quiet. Makes life easier for everyone." The boy glanced over from his group, his eyes narrowing as he caught the tail end of their conversation. She shook her head subtly, a silent plea for him not to get involved. But she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched into fists. After class, as they walked out together, she finally spoke. "You can't keep stepping in," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "They're just waiting for you to mess up." He looked at her, his expression serious. "I don't care what they're waiting for," he said. "They don't get to treat you like that." She wanted to argue, to tell him that it wasn't worth it. But deep down, a part of her didn't want him to stop. For so long, she had felt invisible, like no one saw her struggles or cared enough to stand by her. And now someone did. The tension came to a head the following week. It started small, missing books, whispers that stopped when she entered the room. Then one day, she found her wheelchair pushed off to the side, her belongings scattered across the floor. She stared at the mess, her heart sinking as the class erupted in laughter. The boy stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The laughter stopped as he crossed the room, his expression thunderous. He knelt down, gathering her things and placing them carefully on her desk. "This stops now," he said, his voice steady but filled with an edge of warning. He turned to face the class, his gaze sweeping over them. "You think this is funny? Picking on someone who's already been through enough." No one responded, but the silence was deafening. The teacher, who had been writing on the board, finally turned around, her lips pressed into a thin line. "That's enough," she said sharply. "We don't need a lecture." The boy didn't back down. "Maybe we do," he said, "because it seems like no one here knows how to treat people with respect." The girl's heart raced as the tension in the room reached a breaking point. She wanted to disappear, to shrink away from the attention. But at the same time, a part of her felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. The teacher's expression darkened. "Out. Both of you. Now." The boy hesitated for a moment before nodding. He grabbed his bag and motioned for her to follow. She hesitated, unsure of what to do, but his steady gaze gave her the courage to move. As they sat outside the principal's office, the boy leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "They can't keep getting away with this," he said, his voice low but determined. She glanced at him, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "What if they don't stop?" she asked softly. "Then we make them stop," he replied without hesitation. The principal's door opened, and they were called inside. The conversation was tense, with the teacher's voice dripping with disdain as she recounted what had happened. The principal listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When it was their turn to speak, the boy didn't hold back. He described everything. The comments, the bullying, the way the teacher had encouraged it, even if indirectly. The girl stayed quiet, her heart pounding, but she nodded in agreement as he spoke. The principal leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he considered their words. "These are serious accusations," he said finally. "I'll need to investigate." As they left the office, the girl felt a mixture of relief and dread. The truth was out now, but that didn't mean things would get better. If anything, she feared they might get worse. And she was right. The bullies didn't take kindly to being called out, and the teacher's thinly veiled hostility grew more pointed. The girl found herself watching her back at every turn, waiting for the next attack. The boy, meanwhile, seemed unfazed, his determination only growing stronger. One afternoon, as they walked home together, he turned to her, his expression serious. "You know they're not going to stop until we stand up to them," he said. She looked at him, fear and uncertainty swirling in her chest. "How?" she asked. A slow, determined smile spread across his face. "We'll figure it out." But even as he spoke, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking towards something they couldn't control. The storm was coming, and it was only a matter of time before it hit. The next morning started off eerily calm, the kind of stillness that felt unnatural. The girl had barely settled into her usual spot in the classroom when the teacher walked in, her expression unreadable. The boy arrived shortly after, his usual confidence intact, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes, an awareness that things were shifting. As the class got underway, the girl couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced around and noticed the bullies whispering among themselves, their eyes darting toward her and the boy. It wasn't unusual for them to talk in hushed tones, but this time felt different. There was a strange intensity to their glances, like they were planning something. The teacher's lesson was interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. The principal entered, his presence immediately silencing the room. He carried a clipboard and an air of authority that demanded attention. "Apologies for the interruption," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I need to have a word with a few students." The girl's stomach twisted into knots. She exchanged a glance with the boy, who gave her a reassuring nod. Still, she couldn't shake the sense of foreboding that settled over her as the principal called the names of the bullies and motioned for them to follow him. As they left the room, whispers broke out among the other students. The teacher, however, didn't seem surprised. In fact, there was a flicker of something in her expression, relief, maybe, or satisfaction. The girl couldn't tell. The rest of the day passed in a haze. The bullies didn't return to class, and the atmosphere felt heavier than ever. At lunch, the girl and the boy sat in their usual spot under the oak tree, but neither of them spoke much. "What do you think is going on?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He shrugged, but there was a tension in his shoulders that betrayed his casual demeanor. "Maybe someone finally decided to take them seriously," he said. She wanted to believe that, but something about it didn't sit right. The bullies had always seemed untouchable, like they could do whatever they wanted without consequence. It was hard to imagine that changing so suddenly. The answer came later that afternoon when the principal called both her and the boy into his office. They sat side by side in the stiff chairs, the girl's hands gripping the wheels of her chair tightly. The principal leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "We've received some concerning reports," he began, his eyes shifting between them. "It seems there's been a pattern of bullying in this class, and I want to make sure we address it appropriately." The girl felt her heart race as he continued. He spoke about the importance of fostering a safe and respectful environment, about how no one should feel targeted or unsafe at school. But as he spoke, she couldn't help but notice how carefully he chose his words, skirting around specifics. Finally, he paused, his gaze settling on the boy. "I understand you've been quite vocal about standing up for your classmate," he said. "And while I appreciate your intentions, I need to remind you that there are appropriate channels for addressing these issues." The boy's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The principal turned to the girl next, his tone softening. "And you, if there's anything else you'd like to share, now would be the time." She hesitated, glancing at the boy. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that encouraged her to speak. "It's not just the bullies," she said finally, her voice shaky but steady. "The teacher, she's part of it too." The room fell silent. The principal's expression hardened slightly, but he didn't interrupt. "She doesn't say it outright," the girl continued, her voice gaining strength, "but she encourages them. She makes comments, singles me out. She lets them get away with it." The principal nodded slowly, his pen moving across his clipboard. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "I'll need to look into it further." As they left the office, the boy turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "You did the right thing," he said. But she wasn't so sure. The next day, the bullies were back in class, but something was different. They were quieter, their usual smirks replaced by uneasy glances. The teacher, too, seemed on edge, her movements more hurried than usual. At first, the girl thought maybe things were changing for the better. But then, during lunch, she overheard one of the bullies muttering under his breath. "They think they're so clever," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "They don't know what's coming." Her stomach dropped. She didn't know what they were planning, but it was clear that whatever the principal had said or done hadn't stopped them. If anything, it seemed to have made them angrier. That afternoon, as she rolled out of the classroom, she found a note taped to the back of her chair. It was hastily written, the words barely legible. "You'll pay for this." She froze, her hands gripping the wheels of her chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The boy noticed and quickly stepped over, pulling the note off and crumpling it in his hand. "Don't let them scare you," he said firmly. But she was scared. She didn't know what they were capable of, and the thought of being alone in the hallways or the courtyard made her skin crawl. The boy must have sensed her fear because he added, "We'll figure this out. Together." Still, the unease lingered. That night, as she lay in bed, her mind raced with possibilities. The bullies were furious, the teacher was on edge, and the principal didn't seem to have a firm grasp on the situation. It felt like everything was spiraling out of control, and she didn't know how to stop it. The next morning, as she rolled into the classroom, the girl couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. The tension in the air was almost unbearable, each glance and whisper sending her nerves into overdrive. And then, just before the bell rang, the door slammed open. Everyone turned, their eyes widening as they took in the sight before them. The principal stood in the doorway, flanked by two other adults in suits. "This ends today," he said, his voice ringing out with a finality that sent a shiver down her spine. The classroom froze as the principal's words echoed through the room. His serious tone carried a weight that silenced even the bullies, who sat stiffly at their desks, exchanging nervous glances. The girl felt her heart pounding in her chest as she watched the scene unfold, unsure of what was coming but knowing it would change everything. The two adults who had entered with the principal walked to the front of the room, one carrying a small recorder, the other holding a tablet. They looked around the classroom, their expressions calm but professional, as if they were assessing every detail. The principal took a step forward. "I want everyone to listen carefully," he began, his voice steady but firm. "This school has a zero-tolerance policy for bullying, discrimination, and misconduct of any kind, by students or staff. Over the past few days, I've been gathering information, and what I've learned is deeply concerning." The girl's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure what he had uncovered, but the way he glanced at the teacher as he spoke made it clear that this wasn't just about the students. The teacher shifted uncomfortably, her usual composure cracking as she folded her arms tightly across her chest. "I don't understand what you're implying," she said, her voice tight. The principal turned his attention to her. "I've reviewed several complaints from students and parents," he said. "I've also reviewed footage from the classroom security cameras." He paused, letting his words sink in. "What I saw was unacceptable." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The girl glanced at the boy beside her, who gave her a small nod, his expression tense but supportive. The teacher's face turned pale. "Footage," she repeated, her voice faltering. There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake," the principal said firmly. "We have clear evidence of your behavior, including instances where you not only ignored bullying but actively encouraged it." Gasps rippled through the classroom. The teacher opened her mouth to argue but quickly closed it, realizing there was no way to talk her way out of this. The principal turned to the bullies next. "As for the rest of you, your actions have been documented as well. Each of you will face appropriate consequences." His tone was calm but unyielding, leaving no room for argument. One of the bullies, the ringleader, spoke up, his voice shaking slightly. "We didn't mean anything by it," he said. "It was just a joke." The principal's gaze hardened. "Bullying is never a joke. The harm you've caused is real, and it ends now." As the principal continued to outline the steps the school would take, the girl felt a mix of emotions. Relief washed over her, knowing that the adults were finally taking action, but it was tempered by a lingering unease. She couldn't shake the feeling that the bullies, or even the teacher, might find a way to retaliate. The teacher was asked to step outside with one of the adults, and the remaining administrator addressed the class. "We're here to ensure that this environment becomes a safe space for everyone," she said. "If any of you have additional concerns, we encourage you to speak up." After the adults left, the class was unusually quiet. The bullies sat hunched in their seats, avoiding eye contact with anyone, while the rest of the students seemed unsure of how to react. At lunch, the girl and the boy sat under the oak tree again. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked, her voice tinged with doubt. The boy shrugged. "It's a start," he said, "but we'll have to wait and see." The rest of the day passed uneventfully, and for the first time in months, the girl didn't dread going to school the next morning. The teacher was absent, and a substitute had taken her place, a kind older woman who made an effort to greet every student warmly. The bullies were quieter, their usual bravado replaced with cautious behavior. Things seemed to be improving, but as the days went by, the girl couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The bullies were too quiet, too subdued, and it didn't feel like genuine remorse. One afternoon, as she was packing up her things, she noticed a folded piece of paper tucked into her backpack. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it, expecting another threat. But what she read made her blood run cold. "You think you've won. Watch your back." She showed the note to the boy, who immediately went to the principal. The administration promised to investigate, but no one could determine who had left it. The tension returned, stronger than ever. Every shadow in the hallway, every whisper in the classroom, felt like a potential threat. The girl found herself looking over her shoulder constantly, unable to shake the fear that something worse was coming. And then, one day, it happened. The fire alarm went off during lunch, sending the entire school into a chaotic evacuation. As students filed out of the building, the girl felt a tug on her wheelchair. She turned, expecting to see the boy, but instead found herself surrounded by the bullies. They didn't say a word, their expressions cold and determined as they wheeled her toward the back of the building, away from the crowd. Her heart pounded as she struggled to free herself, but they were too strong. Just as panic threatened to overwhelm her, a familiar voice rang out. "Let her go." The boy stood a few feet away, flanked by two of their classmates. The bullies hesitated, clearly unprepared for a confrontation. "What's your plan here?" The boy continued, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "You're already in trouble. Do you really want to make it worse?" The leader of the bullies glared at him, but released the girl's chair. Without another word, they turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. The girl felt tears of relief streaming down her face as the boy knelt beside her. "You're safe now," he said softly. But as they returned to the rest of the school, the girl couldn't help but wonder, was this truly the end, or just another beginning? The girl took a deep breath, the cool afternoon air filling her lungs as she tried to calm the pounding in her chest. The bullies were gone, and the boy stood by her side, his hand resting reassuringly on her shoulder. Nearby, the two classmates who had come to help exchanged quiet words, their expressions a mix of concern and relief. "Are you okay?" the boy asked gently, his eyes searching hers for any sign of distress. She nodded slowly, though her hands were still trembling. "I think so," she said. I didn't think they'd go that far." The boy glanced in the direction the bullies had disappeared, his jaw tightening. "They're scared now," he said, "but that doesn't mean they're done. We have to make sure they're held accountable." As the fire alarm ended and the students began returning to the building, the girl and her small group lingered outside, unwilling to face the crowded hallways just yet. The boy leaned down to meet her eye level. "We'll go straight to the principal," he said. "They won't get away with this." Back inside, the principal's office was quiet, the usual chaos of a school day momentarily muted. The principal listened intently as the girl and the boy recounted what had happened. He didn't interrupt, his expression growing more serious with every word. When they finished, he nodded firmly. "You did the right thing by coming to me," he said. "We'll investigate this immediately, and I promise you, there will be consequences." The girl hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you really think it will stop them?" The principal leaned forward, his tone steady and reassuring. "It has to," he said. "We're not just addressing the bullies. We're changing the culture of this school. It won't happen overnight, But we'll get there. True to his word, the principal acted swiftly. The bullies were called in one by one, their parents notified, and a formal disciplinary process began. For the first time, it felt like the school was taking a firm stand, not just for the girl, but for anyone who had ever felt unsafe or unwelcome. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the school began to shift. The teacher who had encouraged the bullying was officially removed, and a new teacher took her place. A compassionate and understanding woman who made it clear that her classroom would be a safe space for all students. The bullies, now under strict supervision, kept their distance, their earlier bravado replaced by quiet caution. The girl still felt uneasy at times, but the support she received from the boy and a growing group of classmates made a world of difference. One afternoon, the girl found herself at the oak tree again, the sunlight filtering through the leaves as she and the boy worked on a school project. It felt strange, almost surreal, to sit there without the shadow of fear hanging over her. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked, voicing the question that had lingered in her mind. The boy considered this for a moment before replying. "I think it's getting better," he said, "and I think we'll keep making it better, together." The girl smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. She had spent so long feeling isolated, but now she realized she wasn't alone. There were people who cared, people who were willing to stand up for what was right. The months passed, and the school continued its efforts to create a more inclusive environment. Programs were introduced to educate students about empathy and respect, and the administration made it clear that bullying would no longer be tolerated. The girl, once so quiet and withdrawn, began to find her voice. With the encouragement of her classmates, she joined a club focused on advocacy and became an active participant in discussions about how to improve the school's culture. One day, as she spoke in front of a small assembly, sharing her story with a mix of nervousness and determination, she realized just how far she had come. The whispers and judgmental stares that had once filled the hallways were gone, replaced by something she hadn't dared to hope for: acceptance. After the assembly, the boy found her near the auditorium doors, a proud smile on his face. "You were amazing," he said. She blushed, her confidence still a work in progress. "I just wanted them to understand," she said. "I wanted them to know that it's not okay to make someone feel like they don't belong." "And you did that," he said. "You're making a difference." The girl looked around, taking in the faces of her peers as they left the auditorium. There were still challenges ahead. There always would be. But she felt stronger now, more prepared to face whatever came her way. Later that day, as she rolled through the school's main hallway, she noticed a small group of students helping a younger boy who had dropped his books. It was a simple gesture, but it made her heart swell with hope. Things were changing, one step at a time. That evening, as she sat under the oak tree with the boy, she reflected on everything that had happened. The pain, the fear, the uncertainty, they were still a part of her story, but they no longer defined her. She had found strength in herself and in the people who had stood by her side. "Thank you," she said softly, turning to the boy. He looked at her, surprised. "For what?" "For being my friend," she said, "for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." He smiled, his expression warm and genuine. "You didn't need me to believe in you," he said. "You've always been strong. You just needed someone to remind you." As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the school grounds, the girl felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. Her journey wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt ready to face whatever came next. And as she looked around at the world that was slowly changing, she realized that she had already won, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong. She had found her place, her voice, and her strength, and that was just the beginning.